Uhuru, comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday study featuring Chairman Amalia Shatella. My name is Akile Anai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. These studies are so important, and we encourage you right now to invite your friends and family to it. This week, Chairman Amalia Shatella will be reading from his most recent work, Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. We'll be studying Chapter 4, the Deepening Crisis of Imperialism, from pages 117 to 143. This lesson we'll be receiving today will help us understand what's happening in the world, why it's happening, and gives us a clear direction on what we need to do. To understand the crisis of this social system is to be reassured that our victory is possible. Following the study, we will open it up for our live viewers to ask questions. It's my honor now to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African Revolution, Chairman Amalia Shatella. Uhuru, Chairman.
Thank you, comrades. I want to express appreciation to everyone who's turned up for this discussion. And as it has been mentioned, we'll be looking at Vanguard and Chapter 4 of Vanguard. Vanguard is the book publication of the political report that I took to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. And the political report is the responsibility of the chair of the African People's Socialist Party to pull together an assessment of what the world looks like, how it got to be this way, what it is that we have to do to move our struggle forward. And it is a political report that once written for 3 or 4 months, the members of the party have an opportunity to discuss it and debate it. And at the Congress itself, it's discussed and debated again, and then it's voted on. And so the political report, the Vanguard that I'm reading from, is a document that was debated, discussed, voted on, and accepted by the membership of the African People's Socialist Party. I wanted to make that clear because this is not just some one who put together and wrote a book and said, here it is. This is a book that was written, a report that was written that describes the events in the world, what they mean to our struggle, the historical basis for how it is that we got to be where we are now, and what it's going to take to get us out of this situation. It's a dynamic document that is designed to not only explain the world, but help us to change the world. That's the basis of the political report. And I think it's important to say that. And right now, what we're looking at is thousands of people in the streets in this country. The federal government is engaged in running battles with people in places like Seattle and Portland in the Northwest. And there are other places where huge mobilizations are occurring, sometimes in places like Austin, Texas, where at least one person was killed shot during a protest. Aurora, Colorado, people in motion demonstrating, and some of the most what would be considered the most unlikely places in the United States. We've seen incredible, massive mobilizations, people demonstrating. In Louisville, Kentucky, hundreds of Africans who were carrying assault weapons and shotguns and things like this, and dressed in black combat gear, marched down the streets demanding justice and turn over the killers of 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, an African woman who was killed in Louisville, Kentucky, in a situation that no one has even yet been charged. So it's an extraordinary situation that's happening domestically. And around the world, we see that the economy, the world economy is in a state of reconfiguration now. In many ways, we saw this happening with the struggles of our peoples just to take our resources back in places like Venezuela. The struggle of people in Iran to achieve some kind of leadership over their own lives, to determine their own future of themselves and the people in the region, the people in Iraq and Syria. All of these are forces who have been pushed into a situation of having to break free from the stranglehold that this whole colonial capitalist system has on them, on us, and the peoples of the world. And in the middle of all of this, of course, there's been the growth of China as an economic and political force. There's been the resurgence of Russia that once was considered dead with the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the extent that the bourgeoisie, the rulers of the United States, were singing dirges and dancing on the graves, more or less, of the Russian presence, treating it with the most serious kind of contempt, declaring the existence now, they said, of a unipolar world, that the US was the only world that was leading. And some US pundit had even come up with the notion of the end of history had been achieved, the so-called, this is Fukuyama, who wrote this text declaring what they referred to as liberal democracy or liberal imperialism, more or less, had achieved the ultimate goal in human society, that beyond this, there was nothing. And of course, all of that is in a state of shambles today, as anybody can see. And right now, the United States is still trying to claim hegemony over the world. It is sending warships through the South China Sea, trying to threaten the Chinese, who have become a major force and that has achieved near military equivalency with the United States, that's threatening the whole balance of power. And as the United States continues to reveal itself as being this entity that's almost a spent shell, it has the biggest army in the world. It used to have what was clearly the strongest economy, the biggest economy in the world, and all of that seems to be overshadowed by events that's happening in the world and the growth of rivals challenging it and challenging its hegemony. These are other states that we're talking about. Then there are the peoples of the world who are engaged in struggle, trying to find their way and to create lives that's free of white power, free of the white man on with his boot knee on the necks, all of our necks. So it's a whole different period that we're living in. And with these extraordinary mobilizations, extraordinary strength of demonstration of the potential of people's struggle, approximating almost a revolutionary period, it's extremely important for us to achieve clarity. And as I mentioned, this political report that I'm reading from is something that was presented to our party Congress in 2018. And it talked about just what was happening in the world, why the crisis was emerging, what it meant in terms of our struggles for our liberation. So we are not frightened by events on the one hand. On the other hand, the events are not the factors that's determining how it is that we should move. I say we are not being dragged around whiplash by this event versus that event. We know something about the whole social system, and we know that there is the crisis that we're looking at now is something that began some time ago, and it just achieves different features at different times, given on how contending circumstances represent themselves in the world. So we want to talk about that. And we want to talk about the unraveling of the hegemony, not only of a social system, but particularly the unraveling of the leadership of the elite of the white nationalist world, what they like to refer to as the West, the mostly white European and US countries, how they had come to some conclusions about how to lead the world a while ago, and how all of that is in a state of absolute total disarray, and that the system is trying to solve its problems, it's fighting on so many fronts, some of them internal contradictions that have to be resolved. Some of them are contradictions that come as a consequence of peoples around the world fighting to take back our resources, our lives, our dignity. And in the process of doing that, many of us are throwing off these identities and notions of the absolute right of the capitalist colonialist authorities to determine what our future is going to look like. It's a very extraordinary moment in history, and I want to just go ahead and talk about that and read about that. And comrades, I know that some of the things that we talk about in this discussion may appear to be not have immediate significance, but that's not true. The fact is that we are trying to build a revolution. Protests, magnificent, love protests. We see disarray all over this social system, not only in this country, but around the world. That the chains holding the peoples of the world are locked into this deadly embrace with white nationalist imperialism that sucks the life, sucks the blood, sucks the dignity of the people on the planet Earth. All of this is in a state of transition, and it should be in a state of transition. The conditions for revolution are ripening every day. And so we need to have the ability to make this revolution, to take it beyond the protests. The protests are wonderful, but we have to go beyond protests. The protests are wonderful because they represent, again, they destabilize the system that's responsible for our oppression. So we love that. We love the crisis of imperialism, but we have to be able to go beyond protests. And I appreciate the protests, but protests are simply symptoms of the depth of the contradiction. When you see the feds, the federal government of the United States, the colonial power, the chief colonial power having to intervene and engaging in combat on the streets of Seattle or combat in the streets of Portland with thousands of people, and then thousands more are rising up in response to this, then it's a situation, a system that's in a state of absolute or near absolute disarray. And this system is fighting these battles within. And of course, the crucial contradiction within that often gets lost of by much of this is the colonial oppression of African people, the colonial oppression of the indigenous peoples of this land and throughout what is now called the Americas. This is the foundation of the whole social system, and sometimes we lose sight of that. Sometimes we can see street battles in a lily white or near lily white Portland, Oregon, and the right of the white people in Oregon to engage in these battles, the rights of the people in Seattle to protest what happened to the white people in Oregon can sometimes overshadow the fact that the fundamental contradiction that kicked it all off, as it always does, is the colonial oppression of African people, and then the colonial oppression of other peoples of this land. And what has to happen, of course, is that the motion of the people, the protests, have to be moving toward what end? And the end has to be the overturning of a social system that's based on colonialism and slavery. It's not based on the feds fighting white people in Portland or anything like that. It's based on, it's a system that rests upon a foundation of colonial slavery. And that's the thing that we have to remind everybody of all the time. So we love the protests and we love the protesters, and we are really happy to see that's happening. But if they want fundamental change, what's going to happen is that they're going to have to unite under the leadership of the pedestal of the so-called essential workers, as we have now been characterized. We've always been essential, just haven't been recognized, and we can talk about that on another day. But those forces have to be about more than simply stopping something happening to them, but have to deal with the fundamental problem that's responsible for every contradiction that we see happening in this country, happening in this world. And that is the contradiction of of capitalism. Colonial capitalism, a whole social system that has its origin, that was founded, that was created through enslaving African people, through colonizing African people, through colonizing the vast majority of the people of the world who are still colonized. And that's the thing that we have to really deal with, because this is something that we must understand, and why it's necessary for us to do things like the studies that we do right now. It's not just studies for some people to know some history. It's studies that will help us to be able to understand and interpret what's happening in the world today, what we have to do to deal with the social system, how we can overturn it. And this helps us to understand also that you can't judge a movement by its own consciousness. So people have their own explanations for why they're moving a certain way in Portland, or why they're moving in a certain way in Los Angeles, but you can't judge a movement just by its own consciousness. Anymore, as it has been said before, you can't judge me by what I think of myself. So we have to get to the root of the question. We have to understand, what is it that's pushing the people out into the streets? What is it that was responsible for the kinds of uprisings that we see with the murder of George Floyd? And how is it infectious and having peoples all around the world dealing with it? And the other thing that becomes clearer to us every day is that we're dealing with a world social system. This is not an American social system. This is not a British social system. The entire world has been connected together through slavery, through colonial slavery. Colonial slavery created this thing called colonial capitalism. And capitalism was born through the enslavement and colonization of the peoples of the world. That's the pedestal upon which everything rests. And every headache, every problem that somebody has in the world can be connected directly to the existence of this. And through the advent of colonial capitalism, what we have seen also is the fundamental contradiction in the world. The main contradiction around which all the others revolve is the contradiction between oppressed nations and oppressor nations. And this is where the capitalist system came into existence, and it came into existence as a consequence of Europe leaving a disease-ridden, unfree Europe, attacking the rest of the world, especially through Africa. And then the colonization of the world that created a whole new social system, brought the world together in a way that it had never been brought together before, tied it into a single world economy, and locked us all into this united process. So there is no European reality separate from the reality of the Africans or the peoples in the Americas and around the world. It's now one reality pulled together by colonial capitalism, locked into this place as a world system. And we can see the problems. When we understand that, we can see how if there's an infection in one part of this world system that's problematic, then it gives us an opportunity to understand how the entire body is sick and what we have to do in order to deal with it. So I just wanted to say those things because we need to understand this world. And I know that I'm talking mostly to a party that is essentially a working class party. It doesn't mean that we are the quote unquote working class. We are a party of the working class. We are the advanced detachment of the working class. We are, if you will, the general staff of the working class. We are the vanguard of the working class. And we have to struggle as representatives of the working class to really know the world, because our objective is to take power, is to move this situation so that the working class actually ultimately becomes the ruling class. That's different from what Bernie Sanders and these other people talk about when they want to talk about socialism. Socialism is a consequence of the working people, the working class becoming the new ruling class as a consequence of having captured political power, as a consequence of having captured control, ownership and control collectively of the means of production, so that production, which has always been socialized, now is united with ownership, which is now also socialized. And this is what we are talking about. And the workers have to be prepared. And so we work all the time. All the political reports that have been written and presented, these discussions that we do stem from a recognition that the vast majority of the people to whom I'm talking are not people who hang out in universities and get involved in these lofty discussions about the world, people who are trying to find a way to live under these circumstances. The advanced representatives of the people who live in these communities of African and oppressed peoples around the world, and who have the responsibility of taking power over our own lives and overturning a social system that negates our lives and negate our ability to prosper. Even though we create most of the value and wealth in the world. So we want to talk a little bit about how this current crisis, where it comes from. And the current crisis started before May 25th and the murder of George Floyd. And we can see evidence of it. We can see how this whole thing with the ruling class split and in battle with each other. And there are other things that it's important for us to understand and recognize. So I want to go ahead and begin this discussion now. And I'm on page 117 in the book of Vanguard. This is the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. And Chapter 4, The Deepening Crisis of Imperialism. This is written in 2018, longer, much earlier than when George Floyd was killed. And there were other events, of course, that predicted events as they are moving forward, not the specific killing of George Floyd, but the crisis was here. And we talk about it here. And I want you to understand what it is that we're talking about so that you have a responsibility to go out and to organize our people to describe what's happening in these demonstrations, in these mobilizations, to help the people who involve them in them to understand what it is they're involved in and what the outcome must be, what it is that we have to fight for. And I know that many of these, I know that more than 30 cities and what have you, we've been involved in initiating mobilizations of our own in the party and the Uhuru movement. I know that we have done that, and I know that we have participated in mobilization and should actions that others have initiated, and that we are planning others. But this is what informs us. This political report, this understanding is what informs us, and you have to be able to speak to masses of the people, helping to the people to understand exactly what it is that we're fighting, and then helping the people to have confidence in the future, because it's our future. And this is the political report helps us to understand that. So on page 117, Chapter 4, The Deepening Crisis of Imperialism, the tipping point of the uneasy equilibrium. The unending wars waged by the US from one end of the earth to the other are evidence of the crisis of imperialism. Perhaps the greatest example of imperialist crisis today, however, can be found in the White House, the seat of US governmental power. Every day, there is a new scandal associated with the regime of US President Donald Trump. A host of explanations is being advanced by the thinking representatives of the white ruling class for why the Trump administration continues to be embroiled in crippling controversy. The struggle being waged against his regime by other sectors of the white ruling class is extraordinary. The Trump regime is not fundamentally different from the Obama regime that preceded it. It is certainly not a departure from the predatory colonial capitalist campaign of Hillary Clinton, his 2016 Democratic Party opponent, whose loss to Trump sent shockwaves through the white ruling class elite. That's important to understand. It's important to understand that we're up against a social system experiencing crisis, that it doesn't make that much difference who is at the obvious helm of it. It's like being concerned that the bus that we're being on a bus to hell, being concerned that the driver has revoked license or failed the driver's test or has bad character or something to that effect. We're on a bus to hell no matter who's driving it. It would be a bus to hell if Joe Biden were driving it. It would be a bus to hell if Bernie Sanders were driving it. It would be a bus to hell if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were driving it. It's a bus to hell. We're talking about the US imperialist movement, the whole US social system, the imperialist system itself. It's ruinous, and it has no redeeming qualities, and it doesn't matter who it is that's representing this system. It's the system itself, the nature of the system. And again, you can't judge a social movement by its own consciousness, by what it thinks of itself. You have to really understand the system. You have to understand the process that gave birth to it in order to understand how to deal with it. So we have said all along that the electoral process is simply the vehicle for nonviolent struggle by contending sectors of the colonial capitalist ruling class for control of the state for their own profit-making advantage. Nothing clarifies this fact more than the 2016 US presidential campaign and Trump's election. The state, the entity that they're fighting to control through this electoral process, is the organ of coercion utilized by the ruling class to protect the system of colonial capitalism. It is clearly the police, courts, jails, and other repressive institutions. Everything you see happening in Portland, Seattle, everything that happens on a daily basis with more enthusiasm, more intensity than even what's happening in Portland and Seattle in the African communities around this country, where Trump has also sent federal troops into Chicago to deal with Black people there. So we say it is clearly the state is the organ of coercion utilized by the ruling class to protect the system of colonial capitalism. That's what it's there for. It is not a crime busting operation. It was to protect the social system, which is why you find the heaviest concentration of police in the African community, and which is where you find this same kind of concentration of police in the barrios and on the borders, dealing with the Mexican and other people who are colonized there. We say the state is clearly the police, courts, jails, and other repressive institutions. It is also the military and the various intelligence components associated with it. The state is the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and the assorted secret police agencies about which most people know nothing, including the NGA, the National Global Spatial, what is it characterized? National Global Spatial Intelligence Agency. That they are in the process of constructing and improving right there in St. Louis, Missouri. The state has existed since society split into irreconcilable classes, into groups locked into a relationship of the exploited and the exploiters, where the exploiters live at the expense of the others. You're talking about people who are exploiters. These are people who are parasites. They live at the expense of other people. They are able to steal value from working peoples in one way or another. At one time, you find it called slavery. At another time, it's called feudalism. It has different designations and definitions, but it's the state, nevertheless, that is responsible for maintaining and protecting this relationship between the slave and the slave master. The relationship must be protected. That is to say, the slave can never be allowed to overturn slavery and the slave master. Therefore, the state is there to protect it. The state is older than the US. In ancient Rome and Greece, the state protected the interests of the slave owners over the slaves. In feudal Europe, it upheld the interests of the nobility over the peasants and serfs. The European imperialist invasion of Africa, Asia, and the lands now known as the Americas created a new capitalist social system. You got to remember that the Europeans before, when we met Europeans, they lived under feudalism, which was a whole different kind of social system. Then it's through their invasion of Africa, Asia, and now what is called the Americas that a whole new social system came into being. It is a social system that is a consequence of tremendous amount of wealth and value coming into Europe off of what is called a slave trade, off of the piracy and brigandage, the colonialism that destroyed much of the Americas and lives of peoples around the planet Earth. This is where value came that developed, if you will, what we now know as Europe and capitalism. So we say the European imperialist invasion of Africa, Asia, and the lands now known as the Americas created a new capitalist social system. So it's not feudalism anymore, it's a capitalist social system. Now the state was no longer simply an instrument of coercion directed at protecting and maintaining the power of a social system within the boundaries of specific European territories. The capitalist state created the structures that protected and projected the interests of the bourgeoisie in faraway places. There was a bourgeoisie made possible by the primary features of what Karl Marx termed the primitive accumulation of capital, the genesis of the capitalist system itself. The capitalist state was a consequence of Europe's imperialist assault on Africa and the rest of the peoples of the world. It has always had a global capacity. The capitalist state this is different from the feudal state and the states that preceded it. This feudal state was a state that locked itself within the boundaries of particular countries and societies. Now, with the imperialist Europe going out into the rest of the world, the state now also has to be altered. So the state changes. Now, the capitalist state emerges. And the capitalist state is a consequence of, as we said, of Europe's imperialist assault on Africa and the rest of the peoples of the world. It has always had a global capacity flowing from its parasitic and predatory origin. Contrary to the notion that globalization is a new historic phenomenon, capitalism was born as a world system. The capitalist state is an international state power. Without bourgeois elections, the ruling elites would be reduced to fielding their own private armies to advance their interests. They would be nothing more than the warlords that we see in some countries that have not achieved or developed the slavery-funded sophistication of bourgeois democracy most often found in European countries. The bourgeois electoral process was designed to protect the colonialist capitalist system from destruction by internecine war between capitalist predators competing for resources and markets. In this way, the electoral process functions as a component of the colonial capitalist state. So if we're talking about how the elections are nonviolent, generally, nonviolent contests between, in particular, bourgeois countries for control of the state apparatus, this organization of coercion, the FBI, the CIA, the police departments and stuff like that. So whoever controls, whatever force controls them, controls society. And they can control it to their own advantage. And certainly the capitalist system as a whole controls this. And the electoral process is the way that we guarantee that the capitalist system as a whole, that the capitalists as a whole maintain control of the society. But the elections themselves, this process of the elections allow the capitalists, the predators, the thieves and criminals, well, they would be criminals if they were not the ones who made the law, but the thieves, the predators, the parasites, the peace suit wearing thugs, they can now fight among themselves about who's going to control the state apparatus without having to shed blood, their own blood. So they can have these elections. They run people for office. They fund these people for office. They look at the campaign programs and documents. They create schools and institutions where people get trained to put forth programs that suits their interests, and then they train and support candidates who are running for office who represent those interests, and they are funded then by the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie is always fighting. The ruling class is always contending with each other about who is going to be over the entire capitalist system that serves all of them, but this allows them to exercise their thuggery behind closed doors with clever words and things like that that don't reveal to the world just who the hell they are. Increasingly, that's becoming difficult. So we say that in the 2016 US presidential election was also a white ruling class contest for control of the colonial capitalist state. It was a contest that was clothed in bourgeois idealism designed to obscure the intentions and interests of the minority white ruling class in order to win mass support from white people. The ability of the white masses to vote for their ruling class masters shrouds the dictatorship of the white rulers. This ability to vote has come to define democracy in the US and for much of the white capitalist dominated world. So you know you're in a democratic situation because you can vote for this thug over that thug. That's what democracy has come to mean. The 2016 US presidential election was a clear indicator of the growth of crisis of imperialism. The fact that there were 17 Republicans contending for the nomination of their party and 6 major contenders for the Democratic Party nomination, a total of 23 altogether, and that's only if you don't count the Willie Wilson from Chicago, who was a millionaire who tried to run as a Democratic candidate for the presidential nominee. So it revealed, all of these revealed a fractured white ruling class that was incapable of choosing a popular representative of its splintered economic interests. So the crisis of imperialism is almost like every white man for himself. There's disagreement among the ruling class itself. So you've got something like 17 Republicans, each of them being sponsored, having sponsored by sectors of the bourgeoisie, contesting for the Republican nomination. The campaign occurred in a world that is being defined by the struggles of oppressed peoples, whose subjugation is a condition for the success of the overall parasitic capitalist project. While US politicians put their political programs forward as determinants of world history, all the presidential contenders were being driven by imperialist crisis that continues to threaten the stability and existence of colonial capitalism. This is 2018. So Trump breaks up the Atlanticist bloc. In the political report to our 2016 plenary, we spoke of this crisis through the voice of one of the leading imperialist thinkers of the time. That was Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski had recognized the crisis of imperialism for years. And this is not just some guy. Brzezinski was the one who was the national security advisor for James Earl Carter, who initiated the attack in Afghanistan in order to create a Vietnam for Russia. He is the one who was a major advisor for James Earl, for this guy, Barack Hussein Obama, that had told him and tried to advise everybody about this imperialist crisis that makes it impossible or near impossible for the US to rule in the same old way, that you can't just push people around and dominate it around. The world is changing, he's saying. And that in order for the US to regain or maintain some level of leadership, it's going to have to lead from behind. It can't just get in front like it has done typically. So in his 2007 book, Second Chance, 3 Presidents and the Crisis of American Superpower, Brzezinski proved prescient, excuse me, in his explanation of the ruling class split into a myriad of self-serving components fighting for shares in an imperialist pie shrunken by the world's peoples desperately struggling to take back their lives and resources from a blood-drenched imperialism. Says Brzezinski, and I quote, this is really interesting. You would think this guy is some kind of left-wing person, but he was fighting to uphold the system. And here's what this is the kind of advice he gives to the rulers. You know, Brzezinski, like Kissinger, like some of the others who are thinking representatives of the bourgeoisie, is like the Machiavelli of his era. You know, Machiavelli writes The Prince, where he's advising the ruler how to maintain rule forever and this kind of stuff, with the hopes that he would be adopted by the rulers in terms of put on some kind of retainer And so you've got people like Brzezinski, you've got others like Fukuyama, and many others some of whom actually attend institutions created by the bourgeoisie for this purpose, and others who are constantly courting the attention of the ruling class. And these are the policies that I'm suggesting, given the way the world is now. This is how you maintain power. This is what you must recognize by the world. They play the same role for the ruling class that this book, and I am playing for the African working class. This book, the political report to the 7th Congress, like the political report to the 6th Congress, and the political reports preceding them, is a statement to the masses, to the working class, to the advanced detachment of the working class, about what the world is and what it takes to win. So we quote Brzezinski, who says, and he wrote this in 2007, global political awakening. Global political awakening is historically anti-imperial, politically anti-Western, and emotionally increasingly anti-American. In the process, it is setting in motion a major shift in the global center of gravity. That in turn is altering the global distribution of power, with major implications for America's role in the world. The foremost geopolitical effect of global political awakening is the demise of the imperial age. Empires have existed throughout history, and in recent times, American paramountcy has often been described as a new global empire, unquote. So the contenders for the presidency during the 2016 elections were confronted by the reality described here by Brzezinski. They represented different sectors of the white ruling class. As Trump declared at every opportunity during the election campaign, they were hirelings of big money. Their individual political programs advanced during the campaign, excuse me, represented the different positions of their big moneyed employers who needed control of the U.S. state to realize their aims. So that's what it is that we're looking at. But despite the fact that individual blocks of capital always fight to advance their own interests, and were doing so in 2016 presidential election, they have usually struggled within a generally agreed upon framework. Since the mid-1940s, when the US and much of Europe coalesced around a general strategy to counter the growing influence of the Soviet Union, the US took the lead in creating what became known as the Atlantic Bloc, whose proponents are known as Atlanticists. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was the most obvious political and military manifestation of the Atlantic Bloc. It also involved economic and security components that bound the liberal anti-communist white rulers into a common strategic trajectory for white domination, for world domination. US leadership through the Atlantic Bloc included the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, and an assortment of other related institutions, including international trade and economic bodies. Also, a part of this bloc was an international court system that obeyed US edicts, although the US refused to recognize its authority as applicable to itself. The United Nations inherited the role previously assumed by the League of Nations, another US brainchild that failed to win support within ruling circles after being advanced by US President Woodrow Wilson following the First Imperialist World War. So this is not uncommon, what we're looking at. Like these world powers, they get together and have got together at times of stress and crisis. They've even changed the borders of the whole world. You know, they in 1884 to prevent war among these thieves and and pirates, they sat down in Berlin, Germany, and said, look, we don't have to fight over Africa. Let's carve it up. And let's give each of us what it is. It's like some mafia meeting or something like that, or what's portrayed as a mafia meeting in the movies, you know. Let's carve it up and share it out among ourselves so that we don't have to fight over this. And that's the Berlin Conference did that. And that's how Africa looks the way it does today, because white people got together in a room in Berlin, Germany. I've been there in Berlin, Germany, and carved up Africa for themselves. And as a consequence of that, Africans call ourselves all of these names that were, in most instances, created by the Europeans themselves. So in something like 1814 or 15, I think it was, after Napoleon had run rampant around Europe, making wars and what have you, they defeated Napoleon, and they had a conference, a Vienna conference, where they carved up Europe and said, look, this is how this stuff is going to be. And they changed the borders, changed definitions of who was who and what have you in Europe. So this is not a new phenomenon that we are talking about. Now, they've come to certain kinds of agreements about how we're going to rule the world, how we're going to maintain peace among ourselves through these kinds of agreements. And so after the first imperialist world war, and I call it imperialist world war, it's commonly known as World War I. And it was, I think, supposed to be the war to end all wars or something to that effect. But after this war, they had a conference, and it was called at Versailles. And it was the Versailles Conference where they punished Germany and took land and territory from Germany and dispersed it among themselves. They gave some German holdings in Africa to Belgium. They just reorganized the whole world and among themselves. And then after in World War I, the first imperialist war was a bloody war. I mean, a lot of people died. It was one of the most horrendous wars that had been experienced at that time, up to that time. Then with the second imperialist war, because you have a situation where people were not satisfied with the deal they got the last time. And that was certainly true of Germany, who, as I mentioned, had lost a lot of its possessions and prestige, et cetera. Not just Belgium, by the way, but had lost a lot of it, territory, prestige. So Germany initiated, Germany is accused of having initiated the second imperialist world war. And this is where we see, you know, Hitler and what have you, and the whole German population mobilized to take the world. Deutschland über alles. Germany over all of it, you know, and so this was a definite breach of the agreement that had been made. And then after that war and Germany's defeat, the white powers got together and created this institution that was supposed to end the fighting among the thugs, among the pirates and what have you, and allowed them to have harmonious and democratic control of the peoples of the world without having to fight among themselves. And this is what they call the United Nations. That's where the United Nations came from. It was one of the institutions that came from the Atlanticists. And you had the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that was designed to keep the Soviet Union, or Soviet Russia, if you will, from infecting the world body politic and isolate it, to contain it and what have you. So you had these agreements that were created. You had, in addition to that, you had institutions like the so-called Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, which was something that Secretary of State George Marshall, U.S. Secretary of State, who had been a general, that initiated what they call the European Recovery Program. That was enacted in 1948, and what it did was provide $15 billion, that's something like $121 billion in today's dollars, to refinance the rebuilding effort in Europe. And it did this to prevent communism from spreading throughout Europe. That is to say, what they perceived as the white workers being able to control Europe. The World Bank was created in 1944 and along with the IMF, International Monetary Fund. So you had the United Nations, all of that. And also in 1948, you had another institution that often gets overlooked, this entity that's called Israel, where this was to be a peacekeeping, imperialist controlling entity that was stuck there in the Middle East of these white people who left Europe and attacked the Arab lands for tremendous amounts of oil, resources, and that represents such a critical, strategic, geopolitical landmass, and they needed white people in charge of it. And so they embraced the Zionist movement, that these white people who were not able to be integrated into the capitalist system, or were unwilling to be integrated into the capitalist system, and needed their own landmass to be able to initiate a capitalist entity, a capitalist state that we now call Israel on Palestinian land. All of these things were coming together more or less at the same time. They were brought together, and the Atlanticist bloc was the bloc of capitalists, the bloc of imperialists that more or less provided leadership for the entire capitalist world, certainly the white capitalist world. And at that time, you got to remember that was before China intruded into the situation in a very serious way in terms of opening up in the 1971, 72. It had shut down, and so European powers were not able to penetrate China like they were much of the other places in the world. So here we are talking about so the U.S. leadership again. Through the Atlantic Bloc include the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and all of these were blood-sucking entities. They still take all kind of loot and resources out of Africa today. The United Nations and an assortment of other related institutions, including international trade and economic blocs. Also, a part of this bloc was an international court system. So anyway, we say the United Nations inherited the role previously assumed by the League of Nations. And this role was as unifier and peacekeeper among predatory imperialist white powers that have historically gone to war over divisions of the colonial capitalist spoils among themselves. Like the League of Nations, the United Nations was to function as a supranational agency that assured peaceful, non-violent European control of the world's oppressed colonized people. So you read the UN Charter, and they have all these lofty terms about peace, etc. They were talking about peace among themselves in the process of controlling the colonized, oppressed peoples of the world, and most of whom could not even be in the United Nations when it was established. And even so, it was the United Nations that was established on extraordinarily undemocratic terms, so that the General Assembly, where most of the countries were participants, could talk all they wanted to talk, but anything that came from them could be vetoed about this executive entity that oversaw the entire thing. And this was just a handful of countries that constituted that. So it was a totally undemocratic process. So the entire Atlanticist arrangement was designed to advance the interests of capitalists and the capitalist system by containing Soviet Russia. Another goal was to smother Germany's historical proclivity for violent domination of Europe that had resulted in the two previous imperialist wars to divide the world. And of course, you know, we say Germany was a loser in this process. So we can say Germany's proclivity, but you know, Europe was characterized essentially by just ongoing war among these contending and contesting tribes and stuff like that for a long period of time. Europe was known just for warfare among what we now call Europe, among the inhabitants of that land. The Atlantic Bloc was created to ensure peaceful, white, collaborative domination of the colonized peoples upon whose exploitation the entire parasitic capitalist order depended. For some time now, the Atlanticist arrangement has been freeing. The decline of the decline of the Atlantic Bloc was hastened by the 1991 collapse of Soviet Russia, whose existence was the impetus for its founding and the invention of the imperialist Cold War. So this so-called Cold War, was the undeclared war between Russia, Soviet Russia, the US, and the West. US collaboration with Europe on most questions now became increasingly unnecessary with the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the US no longer had to compete for European loyalty with a now severely crippled post-Soviet Russia. So Europe up to then, the United States and Europe, the United States had to compete for the loyalty of the white people in Europe with Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia was selling itself as a major utopian alternative to the capitalist system that existed in most of the world, and certainly in the white world. Now the Soviet Union was gone, so the United States didn't feel like it had to compete with the Soviet Union, with Soviet Russia, for the loyalty of the Europeans that get in line, we're running it. So with the Soviet Union gone, Russia was no longer an ideological and economic contender in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and other regions of the world. What had been considered a bipolar world had suddenly become a unipolar world, with US imperialism unquestionably at the helm. But all this changed. Lenin's declaration that the capitalists would sell someone the rope to hang in with was realized by the mad rush by all the European capitalists to take advantage of a presumed hapless China. The capitalists invaded with the intention of capturing the more than 1 billion Chinese as a lucrative market. To the dismay of the Europeans and US capitalists, China instead became a major economic and political power whose success had come at the expense of the absolute hegemony of the US and European capitalism in general. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that Soviet opportunism could no longer exert influence over the struggles of the oppressed. Many groups that were stronger in the Middle East and other places because of Soviet support for struggles against US and imperialist white power lost their influence to indigenous movements. I'm just simply saying that the Soviet Union at this time, like most countries, looked out for its own national interests. And it would support groups in the Middle East and groups in Africa that satisfy its interests as in the contest that it was engaged in with the United States and with Europe. And that notion that existed during the time of people like Lenin and Trotsky and during the high tide of Chinese revolution, et cetera, that there was this international solidarity with the workers and peoples of the world, et cetera, had lost its influence to the interests and aspirations of Soviet Union that was trying to exist alone in a sea of capitalist predators. And where revolution around the world had lost what appeared to be its impending conquest of political power. And so it looked like there was this stalemate that existed between Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, and the rest of the imperialist powers. So the Soviet Union engaging in this chess game would support particular organizations and entities in different places of the world that met its own national interests. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that meant other forces on the ground in the Middle East, on the ground in some other places, they now were on equal footing with the ones who were supported by the Soviet Union fighting for the loyalty of the masses. Whereas the Soviets gave them resources, training, monies, arms, on some occasions, support in the United Nations and other international institutions that raise their significance to the peoples around the world, now the Soviet Union is not doing that. So what emerges to speak most directly to the impoverished, immiserated people, especially in the Middle East, is another philosophy, and it's a philosophy that was much older than Marxism. It's a philosophy that seems to speak to the historical assault on people in the Middle East that many of them assumed to be responsible for the impoverished condition, tore down the Muslim empire, if you will, and that was the Crusades. And so the Crusades and Islam became this defining, powerful impetus for the oppressed people there. So that meant that now the Soviet Union is gone, and said this has unleashed massive anti-colonial resistance by Islamic-led movements, fueled by poverty and repression, by domestic US and European puppet regimes, a history of European insults and humiliation, and deeply held memories of the European Christian crusades that provided a religious-based explanation for their struggle. There's no little irony in the fact that the modern jihadist movement was organized, funded, and trained by the US under the regime of US President James Earl Carter. It was Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, who saw this as an anti-Soviet strategy to drain Soviet Russia economically by creating Russia's own Vietnam and Afghanistan, where there was a progressive Soviet-supported government in place. It was the folly of Carter and Brzezinski to think that in the minds of the jihadists, the US white nationalist state would not also be seen as the imperialist infidel that had brought the Islamic world to its knees. It would not be long after the defeat of the Afghanistan government before the jihadists would also turn their guns on the US, other imperialist powers, and imperial craven domestic minions. This is what the CIA calls blowback. In other words, what goes round comes round. This method continues to be used repeatedly by the CIA. Colonialism, direct and indirect, which is the economic base of the global colonial capitalist system, was in a state of flux, along with all the reliant political and economic arrangements tethered to it. The cozy relationship US President Donald Trump appears to want with Russia, the open near declaration of war with the G7 group that presumes to collectively control the world's economy, the rocky courtship of China that involves the move toward rapprochement with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the ongoing internecine wars within ruling circles that stretch across the globe are evidence of a major shift in the political and economic alignments that have defined much of the world for the last 70 plus years of imperialist world domination. The near absolute 500-year control of the world by the white man is on a shaky foundation that our party has described as an uneasy equilibrium. The dominant world colonial capitalist social system responsible for white wealth and security, and the brutal oppressive impoverishment of the rest of us, sits on a foundation of profound, earth-shaking war between the colonial past and the post-colonial, increasingly visible, liberated future. And I think it's really important to understand that, because when you see a lot of motion that's happening, and people try to understand why white people are moving this way, you know, like they talk about now, the situation following George Floyd's murder. So many white people are mobilizing and demonstrating and what have you. And of course, you know, some white people are empathetic to our struggle. But the question is not their empathy. We don't need sympathy. We don't need empathy. We need solidarity under the leadership of the revolution to destroy the whole foundation that's responsible for the social system that's problematic for them. And what we have is a situation where all of the happiness and wealth of the white peoples of the world are connected to, tied to the social system that starves and deprives the rest of us. I mean, this is why, you have, we talk about it all the time, or I mention it frequently in these and other studies and discussions that, the world today, 80% of the people of the world are trying to survive off of something like $2.50 of less than $10 a day, 80%, and less than $10, and 50% of $2.50 or less a day. And then, of course, in Africa, people are lucky if they can even earn enough for a meal a day. This is the arrangement that exists, right now, and on the one hand. But on the other hand, the white people living well in France and Germany, and they talk about the so-called Scandinavian socialism and what have you. Where does all that come from? Everybody's starving. Where is it all coming from? It's coming from us. It's coming from the starved. It's coming from the oppressed, not only in Africa, not only throughout the Americas that they consider underdeveloped. It's coming from the barrios in San Diego and San Isidro. It's coming from the colonial ghettos in Houston, Texas, and South St. Petersburg, Florida. It's coming from Brooklyn, from the Africans there. It's coming from South Bronx. Resources are stolen 1,000 different ways. So when this whole system goes into a state of crisis and becomes increasingly difficult for it to receive this bounty or this booty, if you will, then it creates a crisis among the colonizer population as well. The colonizer can't live as well as it used to. Draconian new laws and regulations are thrust in the midst to control folk. Information is being controlled. That pisses white people off. How the hell are you going to control my information? It's control for everybody else who can't even have a computer, can't even have a smartphone. But the colonized get accustomed to certain conditions of existence. And when those conditions of existence are altered negatively, then that thrusts them into political motion, just as it thrusts the people who are victims and akin to George Floyd into political motion. Both of us are in political motion. And when I say both of us, I don't mean just left-wingers, people who are out there demonstrating, holding up their fists now during the demonstrations in Portland or in Los Angeles and places like that. I'm talking about when I say those people on the one hand, and then all those people who are galvanized and organized right now around Trump. At one point, they were organized as Tea Partiers and stuff like that. But the crisis moves everybody, everything. But just because everybody's moved by the crisis doesn't mean that we're moving in the same direction. And even when we're moving in the same direction, doesn't mean that we're trying to go to the same place ultimately. Or if we're trying to go to the same place, it doesn't mean that it's going to be equally advantageous to us to go to that same place. This is, something that also we need to understand. So we want to say that we of the African People's Socialist Party are contenders on the world stage. We are conscious, organized participants in the struggle of the oppressed and colonized. Our resistance is responsible for starving the bloated white nationalist colonial capitalist system to the point of desperate division. It has resulted in every white man for himself. Today, we see a scramble for new economic and political relations to stave off collapse of respective parasitic European economies within the shrinking system. Indeed, this is a crisis of imperialism. It is also a moment where the possibilities of a new imperialist world war are greater than ever. Extremely significant economic interests are at stake. Bloodthirsty imperialist predators are willing and capable of mobilizing the oppressed of the world to fight other oppressed peoples to their collective extinction in the interest of protecting imperialism. Yeah, they'll have us killing oppressed people everywhere. They have oppressed people killing each other to protect the social system, to protect their own interests. And yeah, I'm just looking how I think a month or so ago, there was a lot of stuff in the news because the U.S. is in a whole state of near war with China. They call it a new Cold War, because China is threatening the hegemony of the United States in a very serious way. This is part of the crisis that they're having to go through. And the crisis is has this material in terms of economics and political power, but it's also a whole psychological thing, about how white people have become accustomed to running everything. And at the point where China is challenging the hegemony, the leadership, the dominance of imperial white power, that's problematic as hell. And I'm sure that's part of what contributes to the spike in suicides and alcoholic deaths and stuff like that in the white population, trying to get used to this notion that the white man doesn't run it. And that takes us to another real serious kind of crisis that this country is experiencing, because a successful bourgeoisie, a successful ruling class, requires a belief among itself and by the peoples that its rule is both permanent and just. You can see how uneasy and shaky it would be to be dominating, killing, and murdering people all over the world and not to believe that your rule is permanent. That one day these suckers gonna stand up. You run into that all the time as Black people. This whole fear that one day that white power would collapse and then what we're gonna do kind of thing. But the whole ruling class and the ruling society has to assume that the rule is permanent and that the rule is just. Even as they kill us, and even as they kill people around the world, there must be a sense of permanence and justness about it. They must have done something. If the police killed them, they must have done something. That was the old refrain. But the ground has been shifting under the feet of white people for a while now. I mean, they've been engaged in struggle in Afghanistan, 25 years, and they can't even crush that people. And people around the world are seeing the growing impotence being made manifest of US and European power. And they see the shakiness of the economics here. They see the unemployment lines and things like that, even before the pandemic. And even after they said they have this economic growth and what have you, people having to work 2 or 3 jobs to try to stay afloat. They don't have any kind of medical care. And I'm talking about in the United States. I'm not talking about places like Africa where, as a matter of course, we expect Black people to have to die and things like that, right? So it's been a shaky foundation for a while now. And a growing sense of uneasiness creeping throughout the entire social system and even among the colonizer. And so now the colonizer is experiencing a growing sense of the fact that this is not a permanent situation. This stuff could change. And we see change happening all around the world. And guess what? Things like the death of George Floyd makes it impossible for them to pretend that it is a just society. So even leading bourgeois newspapers and things like now trying to explain, having to explain the fact that in every state in this country, in small, insignificant counties and cities, demonstration, protests happening, et cetera, having to explain that, are now saying, look, we've been treating Black people wrong forever. Black people can't get justice by the police, by the court systems and things like this. This is stuff that's been pushed to the surface by the heroic resistance of Black people. Black people. That's the cornerstone, that's the foundation. That's the force that has always led any meaningful social movement in this country. Has been the African people who function as the cornerstone of the entire social system. So anyway, so we're looking at, we say that Trump's move to normalize relations with Russia, China, and Korea are being met with efforts to derail negotiations by an assortment of political forces, even within the Trump administration. The US, North American imperialist state, connected internationally with white institutions of imperialist powers of other countries, is generally committed to an Atlanticist strategy with huge political and military economy, revolving around it. There are Atlanticists within the Democrats and Republican parties. And also this whole notion about a duopoly, ain't no duopoly. It's one bourgeoisie. And with two faces. It shows its face this way, that way, depending, and it's convenient for them. At one time, up until the 1960s, when the world revolution of Black people exploded everywhere, and as the Chinese used to say, revolution was the main trend in the world. Up until the 1960s, Africans in this country were connected. The reality is that in this country, you had this growing, this real solidarity between Republican and Democrats in terms of the parties themselves. It's the 1960s that changed that with the struggle for African rights in the United States, even under colonialism. And so you had shifty, opportunist white people who, in the Democratic Party, that was the Democratic, remember, the Democratic Party of the South was the fundamental oppressor, killer, et cetera, in this country. That was who we were fighting against when we were trying to register the vote in the 1960s and what have you. And then what happened, of course, is that the Democratic Party assumed that sector of the bourgeoisie, that it had a greater chance in this contest, this nonviolent struggle against, and we say nonviolent, it was nonviolent for them, but it was violent as hell for us, for those of us who were used as pawns in this process, as the fodder in this process. So the sector of the bourgeoisie concluded that it was going to be easier to win these elections by allowing Africans to participate in the elections under their leadership, not to overturn the system, but as a way of them being able to achieve and maintain power within the system. So they opened up the doors. Not without protest. Africans fought for this, but the liberal sector of the bourgeoisie had fought to have us in the Democratic Party. And so we're in the Democratic Party, and then the Republican Party became what we've called the white man's party. This was the party of Lincoln. Now it's a quote unquote white man's party. Ain't no duopoly. It's one bourgeoisie that will use us any way they can, any way they need to. As long as we're attached to it, we will be used by it. So, again, there are Atlanticists within the Democratic and Republican parties and also within the Trump regime, when several attempts to block Trump's move with Russia, China, and Korea have originated. The efforts by Trump's Vice President Michael Richard Pence and US National Security Advisor John Robert Bolton at the time to scuttle the US Democratic People's Republic Korea, the US and Democratic People's Republic of Korea summit are examples. The Atlanticists do not represent some kind of mysterious great society. They are openly written about and spoken of often in authoritative bourgeois media outlets, including political opposites like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. They represent a very important economic agenda that was organized around the post-Second Imperialist War trajectory to protect and advance capitalist interests redefined by the outcome of the war. Almost all the economic and political relationships in the world were organized around, influenced or driven by the intra-capitalist hegemonic authority of the Atlanticists. The Atlanticists have historically defined the security interest of imperialism. The influence of the Atlanticists reaches down into the retirement funds and job security of the hired killers that make up the officers and ranks of the US military, the FBI, CIA, NSA, local cops, and other terrorist organizations of the imperialist gendarme. The Trump candidacy sounded so outlandish to many because his articulation challenged the long-held Atlanticist assumptions fed to the general public and regurgitated by every so-called legitimate political hack on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. What soon became clear after the 2016 US presidential election is that the intra-capitalist struggle for control of the state was not resolved. It didn't get resolved with this election. Trump, an outsider who contended in the electoral process without economic and political support from and general unity with the Atlanticists, had become at least nominal custodian of the US colonial capitalist state. Nominal custodian. You've seen the struggles that's been happening with the Trump administration with the institution of the state, FBI, CIA, NSA, etc. This is crisis on steroids, not because Trump was an anti-capitalist or anti-colonialist, but because he was not bound by the strategic trajectory that held the capitalists together even when they were in friendly contention. Trump's ascension to the presidency and his actions since then represent the first all-out assault on the very foundation of Atlanticism, which again achieved its rationale and definition in opposition to Soviet Russia. Trump has attacked the relevance of NATO and the United Nations, engaged in flirtations with Russia, and has demanded that the traditional US allies begin to pay their way militarily and renegotiate their trade relations with the US. These are not merely the egotistical rantings of a billionaire simpleton, though he may be that, and they are egotistical rantings. They represent an attempt at a major reorganization of international white power and America's place in it. While the split among the ruling class during the 2016 presidential election exposed the differences among the Atlanticists, it revealed that the Trump regime was an existential threat to their collective well-being under the existing setup. They had all determined to make it impossible for Trump to govern, at least for now. The unity of Trump's opponents is increasingly fragile, as Trump provides payoffs to individual sectors of the opposition, such as monumental tax breaks for the wealthy and all of occupied Jerusalem for Jewish capitalists and others who benefit from the reorganization of the Middle East under imperialist domination. Also, the contradiction within the Atlanticist arrangement have been understated by the ruling class for some time now. Trump has driven the contradiction to the surface, and with it, a realignment of political and economic forces within the US. Some forces are growing or receding in significance, and others, like Trump himself, have been introduced to pronounced respectable significance for the first time. Hence, the intra-capitalist war for control of the state continues unabated. So the election is supposed to resolve this contradiction, but it clearly has not done that. Each US presidential election retains residual state influence from previous regimes. Some, like the Bush regime, have gone so far as to create their own separate intelligence organizations. There is also talk of Trump creating an intelligence organization headed by Colonel Oliver North. North played a similar role for the regime of US President Ronald Wilson Reagan during the illegal war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, and in the CIA orchestrated drug importation and distribution within the United States domestic African colony. However, Trump has waged an outright public war against organizations of the state that are not under control of his regime. The most obvious example has been Trump's furious fight with the FBI, CIA, and other intelligence fronts after they all embellished or distorted the story of improper Russian intervention in the 2016 election. It has been suggested by some that Trump is motivated by private economic arrangements he has in Russia, or by fear of exposure by Russian intelligence agencies of licentious activities during a pre-election visit to Moscow, Trump may also recognize that the effectiveness of his enemies in undermining his ability to govern is directly connected to the perception they have created that his election victory was a consequence of Russian intervention. Whatever the case, his openness to a political US-Russian partnership has caused no little consternation among the Atlanticists, who stand to lose trillions of dollars in political control in Europe and increasingly in the Middle East because of Russian reascendancy on the world stage. Even Obama's failed Asian pivot from Europe to contend with China's growing economic and political influence appears not to have shaken the Atlanticists as much as Trump's threatened embrace of Russia, characterized by US pundits as quote unquote our adversaries. So where are we, Comrade Sister Director?
If you want to keep reading for about 5 more minutes, Chairman.
Okay. As this political report is being written, the Trump regime is under investigation by special counsel. So the whole thing was direct Trump. And it was done from outside his regime, from inside. You had all these forces, they were tied to this whole Atlanticist strategy. And so Trump has been under assault. There hasn't been a day since his election, even up to now, where sectors of bourgeois media have not been attacking every day relentlessly the Trump regime. And like I said, Trump may be a madman, he may be a drunk, he's somebody who's made nasty remarks about women and done horrible kinds of things, but no more than any of the others. No more than any, I mean, people can make John Kennedy charming and what have you, Ted Kennedy, his brother, charming, and, family that's, tragedy following them all around. But they were rapists and they came to wealth through bootlegging liquor and stuff like this. There's nothing different about them and Trump and what they will say and what they will do to people. But Trump has busted up this whole arrangement. And they're all, as I said, it's like debating whether the bus driver that's taking us to hell has a good driving record or not, or whether he cheated on the driving test. We're all going to hell. It doesn't matter who the damn bus driver is or what, what his character is, et cetera. The bus is going to hell. And sometimes it might be better to be in a bus driven by a reckless bus driver who doesn't know how to drive than to be on a bus ride to hell that's been done with great expertise, et cetera. So, as this political report is being written, the Trump regime is under investigation by a special counsel for allegation of collusion with Russia in the 2016 presidential election. And there is an obvious attempt by a collaborative bourgeois effort to undermine Trump's ability to govern and to remove him from office if necessary. And if it would have been possible, it would have done it. I mean, up until recently, that's been the drive that's being made. Some have even suggested involvement by the British MI6 intelligence arm in the exposure of Trump's alleged collusion with Russia. There are daily allegations, some without any legal basis, of impropriety by Trump and or those close to him, along with the manner in which Trump waged his campaign. This serves to tarnish the well-constructed fiction of US governmental high-mindedness and presidential integrity. The fact that Trump campaigned as an outsider meant that he had to campaign against the system itself, the system that had disillusioned so many people through the obvious duplicity of traditional politicians. Trump campaigned against the system that is no longer able to stanch the struggles of the world's peoples, whose oppression allows ordinary white colonizers the psychological benefit of whiteness, even when the economic benefits are not so obvious. Trump has continued to wage a fierce fight back against his colonial capitalist contenders, even as his attacks on the intelligence agencies within the US are causing obvious unease for some imperialist apologists. Trump has also worked incessantly to destroy the myth of a neutral, disinterested bourgeois media working for the benefit of all the people. Trump's term fake news has become accepted lingua franca even within the respected media platforms of the ruling class. This intra-ruling class airing of dirty laundry is tarnishing and undermining the carefully constructed bourgeois myth of a noble white power working in the general interests of the world's peoples. The old adage, your actions speak so loudly I can't hear a word you say, is conspicuously applicable here. There are no good guys in this struggle, neither the Democratic nor Republican parties, not the Democratic Party disguised as the millions of white women who are declaring Me Too, but who are more than 160 years later, still unable to answer the question posed by Sojourner Truth, ain't I a woman too? Not the Democratic Party disguised as thousands of high school students marching against gun violence, as long as the police murders of Africans and the US murders of colonized peoples of the world are not mentioned. Not the Second Amendment defenders, nor the Democratic and Republican protectors of the FBI, who are outraged at alleged Russian intervention in quote unquote our elections, the finest example of democracy, as long as it does not include the African church, does not include an African church in Birmingham, Alabama. The reputation of the office of the US presidency and the most highly respected institutions of the US are being sullied beyond repair. Never mind that Trump is currently successful in carrying out many of his programs with an electoral base hovering at 40% or below, or that his capitalist opponents are too cowardly to make a frontal assault on the citadel. The fact is that there are millions of people within the US and abroad who, while not organized to make a meaningful fight back, are nevertheless disgusted with the US. And I just want to say that these are all of this, what we are describing now, like represent the crisis of a rotten social system that's necessary for revolution. It has to be recognized and it has to be something that's organized to overturn. And that's what our party is all about. I look at look at it, how this whole thing is coming. Look at the Catholic Church. I mean, this has been the great representative of the moral authority of the West. Rapists, pedophiles, international organization of rapists and pedophiles, protected by laws all around the world and what have you, that rape our children, just commit the worst kinds of offenses in the world. This is the United States. This is the United States with a president that walks around talking about grabbing women, in the most vulgar kind of way, that murders African men in the streets with arrogant kind of impunity, and done it all along. And even George Floyd, I mean, look at, is not the best example of the kind of atrocious brutality. Look at what happened to Mike Brown. Look at what happened to the brother in Long Island, who they not only choked to death, but pressed his head into the cement. There was a whole process of just denying the humanity of the colonized. We are colonized, and this is what it is that we're dealing with. And then we're dealing with a social system that has been arranged and led through a certain united trajectory that's now falling apart. The whole social system in a state of disarray. That's why it's so critical for us to understand what it is that we're looking at and what it is that we have to do in order to overturn the system. We have to go beyond protest, and we have to understand the nature of the system, and we have to have the African People's Socialist Party, the organization of the advanced detachment of the working class that's necessary to lead the struggle to overturn imperialism in the lives of African and oppressed peoples around the world. And we say Africans, we mean Africans. We mean Africans here in the United States, we mean Africans in Africa and around the world. We are the critical component to overturning the whole social system and bringing about a whole new world order in solidarity and unity with the oppressed and colonized peoples of the world. Uhuru. We can take off, next time from here. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, I just really appreciate that profound study, and I know that our viewers, our live audience do as well. Before we get into questions and answers, I want to recognize where people are watching from. We have Oakland, California, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Spokane, Washington, Nigeria, St. Petersburg, Florida, Chicago, Illinois, Roselle, New Jersey, Pinellas Park, Florida, St. Louis, Missouri, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Greenville, South Carolina, Occupy Design Tanzania, Ghana, West Africa, Kampala, Uganda, Egypt, Fort Myers, Florida, Brooklyn, New York, Lakeland, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, London, UK, Hempstead, New York, San Diego, California, Trinidad, and Kuwait. So all around the world, people are tuning in to this very important study because it applies to every single one of us, no matter where it is we're located. So I wanted to go ahead and I want to just let people know that if you have any questions for Chairman Amalia Shitela, you have the opportunity right now to ask those questions and the chairman will respond live. So I did want to recognize two comments. One comes from Comrade Diop Olubala. Says, Uhuru Chairman, Black community control of the police is focused on the main contradiction of confronting Africans and oppressed people worldwide. The US, the colonial state. Whether federal troops or regular pigs, these forces must withdraw from our communities as a necessary step toward achieving reparations and self-determination. Many opportunists are scrambling on a treadmill, but we are clear and our work as practical revolutionaries is guided by your teachings. Long live African internationalism. And we had a comment from Comrade Malika Alexander, who is the Midwest Regional Representative for the African Socialist Party, says, we salute your leadership. Uhuru Chairman, we salute your leadership. Your summation of what's happening now in the world points out the superstructure is teetering. You have defined it as rearranging chairs on the Titanic. The party must look at this period to influence history as we make it serve us. We are accomplices in the struggle to bring about a social system, no surrender. Uhuru. And let me just look to see if we have any other questions. But you can take it and I'll let you know if we have a question.
Yeah, I just think that when we talk about revolution, some people think that you are simply talking about some kind of open and major confrontation with the state, with the guns and all this kind of stuff. And that usually happens. But the thing is that what we're looking at is a social system that revolutionaries who have the advantage of the science of society, of historical materialism, we work against that system all the time, and we know how to take advantage of the contradictions inherent in the social system itself. We know what makes it tick. We know what brought it into existence and what have you. We know what strings to pull to help to contribute to its unraveling. And so that's really important for us to understand. So, there's so much stuff that's happening in the world that some of it we lead, some of it we are not leading, but we respect the fact that masses of people in motion. It's the responsibility of the party to be able to take science into the struggle. Comrade Diop's observation in terms of community control the police. African people need to control the state. That's what it's all about. I mean, we raised the demand of Black community control of the police. What we're talking about is that the African people ourselves, that's an anti-colonial demand. And depending on what our capacity is as a movement at any given time, how we approach that question can be different. The objective is to take control of that arm of the state that pretends to be responsible for the security of our community. Let's make it something that really does respond to the security of our community. And if it responds to the security of our community, it would be in the trenches dealing with those, with the feds, troops, with the local domestic troops who are called police and what have you. The community would be defended. But it's more than just defense, as many people understand it, because the question in a struggle for national liberation, any act is a matter of self-defense. It doesn't even matter who fired the first shot. It doesn't matter. I mean, you wake up and you see that the people are colonized, the colonizer occupies our communities and what have you. That's an act of violence. Colonialism is an act of violence. It's perpetuated against us all the time. There's never a non-violent moment in the life of the colonized. So that's perpetual, that's always there. And so, we are constantly working and with how to negate the presence and the significance of the colonial state. That's what democracy is for colonized people. The extent that we can eliminate the influence of the colonial state is the part of the whole process of achieving what many people might recognize as democracy. So these are critical issues, and it's really important for African people to learn contempt for the whole social system, and for damn near everything they say is a lie. They cannot tell the truth, and they can't tell the truth not because of some genetic defect, because the truth exposes this relationship that we have. And so they're always falsifying history, falsifying reality so that it can contribute to maintaining this social system. That's why it's so important for us to do what we're doing now in terms of having these studies, having these discussions, but not as some kind of static academic discussion, but it's something that helps us to understand the world as it's unfolding and our place and role in it and what we have to do in order to win our freedom, win our liberation. Uhuru, yeah.
Uhuru. Thank you, Chairman. And we did get a question in, and more people wanted to let us know where they're watching from. So I'll shout out these cities: Rockford, Illinois, Wichita, Kansas, West Michigan, and Palm Bay, Florida. So Uhuru, and welcome to Amali Taught Me Sunday Study. So this question comes from Nasir Alamin in Kuwait. Ask Uhuru, does the chairman have any thoughts on Angela Davis encouraging people to vote for Biden? It appears that her credibility as a revolutionary is being used as proof to encourage our people to remain in the two-party system.
Ah, boy, Angela Davis' credibility as a revolutionary. Well, she had a bad afro in the 1960s. We knew Angela, and we struggled with Angela for a long time. And it's a political question for us. It was a political question then, political question now. Angela Davis, many people thought that Angela Davis was a part of the Black Panther Party, and she gets away with it now because some people who call themselves the alumni of the party, of the Black Panther Party, assume that they achieve a level of prestige by her being able to say she was a Panther. And hers was a relationship with George Jackson that probably doesn't require discussion. But and she purchased the gun, it seems, that was used by Jonathan Jackson when he initiated the siege in the Marin City Courthouse in 1971 to try to free some of the Africans who had become notorious political prisoners. But Angela, she split from the Communist Party USA. And the basis of her split was, her and some more Africans, was because the Communist Party USA did not support, I can't remember the name of the guy who became governor in Virginia. Some of you will remember his name, African. And this became the basis for the split. And she was to the right of the Communist Party USA, and that's hard to do. I mean, I didn't even know there was any space to right to the Communist Party USA. And they put out something they call the Committee of Correspondence was the group. And the Committee of Correspondence was something that came from the American so-called independence movement. You know, those thugs who were stealing the land of the colonized, of the people here, the indigenous peoples here. They, in the process of making what they call this struggle for independence, this Committee of Correspondence. And so they call themselves the Committee of Correspondence. She's a very American person, so I'm not surprised that she is supporting something. And for those who know, she is not ruining any credentials as a revolutionary. I mean, for most of those who know, I mean, we had fierce struggles with Angela, and fierce struggles, with Angela. Yeah, she cooperated with all kinds of opportunists who were trying to break up genuine struggles that we were engaged in Oakland, California. We had an amazing struggle in Oakland, California for land reform there that would have ended homelessness and things like that by turning the land and properties over to the people who lived in the city. And Angela worked against that. She worked concretely. She wasn't the only one. The Communist Party USA worked against it, the Democratic Party, Republican Party, the Black law enforcement organizations, the Black Preacher Association, even a dead preacher, were all signed against this thing that was going to help the African and other workers who lived in Oakland, California. So we're not surprised anything that comes out of Angela's mouth.
Uhuru.
Uhuru.
Uhuru. This question comes from Comrade Kenya in Lakeland, Florida. Says, Chairman, can you expound on this attack on China and the declining relationships the U.S. is experiencing with its so-called allies?
Yeah, the Chinese thing is really fearful for much of Europe and especially the United States. Although you're going to see more Europeans as the U.S. hegemony declines and China begins to really assert its military equivalence with the United States and challenges the ability of the United States and its minions to control parts of Asia and its growing influence in Africa and what have you. The decline in the U.S. economy, the pitiful state of the government. In fact, the people are writing, this is pundits from the United States are writing that the United States is now seen as a pitiful entity as opposed to some kind of great power. So this is significant. And you can't pick up a newspaper. There's an assault almost daily on China. The Chinese, even the thing that China's success with dealing with COVID-19, when it first was exposed, they were saying, well, China, is successful in dealing with COVID-19 because it's a repressive regime. It is autocratic. And so it can make people put on masks and do all these other kinds of things. Whereas in the US, we have freedom, so we have freedom to die. So unlike China, so this ongoing war, and you see it every day. Every day you look at a newspaper, you see another thing, offense at China. And then sometimes you go on social media and you see some black guys who are demonstrating against Chinese restaurants because they said some people in China did some black people bad, in China, suspicious that black people may be the cause of COVID-19 and was trying to evict black people. And so they have been, promoting anti-Chinese stuff too. That's in tandem with, what the United States government is doing. So this is, China represents an existential threat to the hegemony of the U.S. and the order and the existing world order. As I said, you're going to see many European countries, if they can, they will gravitate more toward China. And depending on how the United States continues to move, China has tried not to have an open fight with the United States. China has been more involved, more interested in just having its own kind of development. It's tried to do it under the radar because it knew that it was going to excite the US and other imperialist forces as it began to achieve greater prominence and authority. So it's tried to lay low with this. And the US keeps pushing. So it's forcing China into a more aggressive stance in response to what the United States is doing. The United States kicked out some diplomats from the US, from the Chinese embassy. So China has responded, kick out some US diplomats. But China holds a major card here, just in terms of the amount of debt, US debt. And China, should it desire, and I don't think it wants to do that for a number of reasons, that it has no interest right now in disrupting the entire world economy, the economic system that's set up until it achieves what it's looking for. And it's working daily. I've talked earlier about the IMF and the World Bank, where China is creating its own entity, economic entity. I can't remember what it's called. The Belt, can't remember the name of it. But many forces are uniting with this Chinese efforts around the world, including countries that are loyal to the United States. The U.S. did everything it could to keep Australia from joining this effort. So you want to see that U.S. is a declining state power. There's no way it can get around it. It's whistling in the graveyard, and increasingly it's becoming demonstrably clear to people that they don't have to be afraid of this guy, that they can go into any kind of relationships and arrangements that they want to. And even as the US is sending all of these so-called rite of passage warships in the South China Sea, China has made it known that it has created new missiles that if it wanted to, it could blow them all to obliteration overnight. It could just wipe them all out. And the US knows that. And so this is nothing but bluster and trying to fool the world. But if China wanted to, it could destroy them. And China is becoming more powerful militarily and economically. So it's an interesting, it's an interesting kind of situation. It's an uneasy equilibrium, as we've said before. It is an uneasy equilibrium. Our stake, Africa and African people, have to seize control of our future, because as quiet as it's kept, the future of China, Europe, the United States, and much of the world depends on their ability to continue to extort and steal resources from Africa, both material and human resources. The Africans must, as Garvey once said, Africa for Africans, at home and abroad. That is the struggle that we have to unite with. And of course, this is why you need an African People's Socialist Party. This is why you need an advanced detachment of the working class, because the African petty bourgeoisie and African elsewhere, you know, they've really simply sold out the future of Africa and African children. The working class is going to have to take control, and it's going to have to take control with its own organization, the Advanced Detachment, the African People's Socialist Party, Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman. And I'll take one more question. And also, Tachara said it was Belt and Road Initiative.
Belt and Road Initiative, that's what it is.
Yeah. So we have, this question is actually kind of appearing in multiple different ways. So I'm gonna just go ahead and answer it. People really want to know about your thoughts or comments around this NFAC, or the Not Effing Around Coalition, their presence in Louisville. Tachara, well, this question comes from With Our Eyes on Facebook, and from Tachara asks similar. NFAC has discovered that the Black militia is a legal bourgeois tolerated formation. Is this to be a primary form of Black community control of police in this era? So kind of.
I don't even know if NFAC is presenting itself in that fashion. It shows up and says, if you don't do it right, we're going to come back again. We might burn the town down. We might do any number of things like that. It does not, as far as I can see, connect itself to a what in beyond responding to specific and immediate kinds of contradictions. I think it's an important development. I think the appearance of armed Africans, similar to what we saw, at least having some, at least obvious similarities to what we saw with the emergence of the Black Panther Party. Black Panther Party, was the Black Panther Party as it put itself forward first for self-defense. In the face of the grotesque murders that African people were experiencing, not only down south, but in Oakland, California, where the police department was recruited white cops, crackers from down south, huge crackers who would, brutalize and dominate the people there. So the Black Panther Party for self-defense, and it was a really exciting and thrilling scene to see these Africans who picked up guns, and it was great inspiration, morale boost, and things like that. So that's important. It's important. I think it's part of the whole fracturing of the social order that we're looking at also. But revolution is the thing that has to be sought and fought for. And the question that we are looking at is whether, in fact, it's part of a revolutionary movement. It's not just enough to be prepared to fight back, quote unquote, but to engage in revolutionary struggle. And if you engage in revolutionary struggle, the reality is, as good and morale boosting as this kind of display is, if you engage in revolutionary struggle with arms, then ultimately you're talking about guerrilla warfare. And engaging in guerrilla warfare presupposes that you do not confront a more powerful enemy, arms in hand, face to face, that guerrilla warfare obeys different kinds of rules, that where the people are the primary forces, even though the guerrilla, is very significant, but you don't attack a powerful force face. You attack it when it's weak. You hide. You assault the enemy. You wear it down. But to confront it openly like this, you don't have the Apache helicopters. You don't have a whole bunch of other stuff that they would bring to bear that they did just against this brother in New Orleans. Who age is a mother. This brother in New Orleans, who I thought was an incredible heroic figure, who shut the entire New Orleans down, one man with a gun who from atop of Howard Johnson, I think it was a Howard Johnson hotel, and started shooting cops and what have you. I mean, you know, we've seen the power of an armed resistance, but the thing is that this resistance has to be beyond just a spurt of anger or you know, an example of a display of courage. It has to be tied to revolutionary objectives, and perhaps, in fact, is about that. I don't know, but I do know that it represents, its appearance represents a certain kind of crisis of the whole social system. Even is, as I understand, they got permits and what have you to walk down the streets, etc. Even so, I think it's a manifestation that white power is not happy to see. It's our responsibility as revolutionaries to take it beyond just a display of weapons and saying, get your stuff right, or we're coming back next week. You know, something to that effect. Uhuru.
Uhuru. So we are getting, well, it's about time now. I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
Go ahead.
Before we close. Okay.
There's somebody else. Oh, I thought you were saying.
Oh, no, we have to.
Yeah.
About 5 minutes to close. So I don't know if you want to say anything else before we get into announcement.
Well, this is just a really important moment. That's all. I mean, the reason we're going to the study, the thing that makes them significant right now is because the whole imperialist system is experiencing an extraordinary crisis. And this is the crisis that that we take advantage of. We see, how do we win? We don't treat this as our crisis, their crisis. And so how do we deepen this crisis? How do we provide leadership for all of the stuff that's happening out in the world? And this is part of why we have this discussion, so that the party members and our supporters are armed to understand what's happening, why it's happening, who Trump is. Don't this fixation on Trump. This fixation, but Trump is just one expression of imperialism trying to rescue itself. And it would have to rescue itself even if Biden or Bernard Sanders or anybody else was there. It would have to try to rescue itself there, and it would have to use extremes. Even Trump is characterized as an extremist because the old way just wouldn't satisfy what masses of people wanted. Some of the same people who voted for Obama voted for Trump because they thought they saw in Obama this other extreme too, saying we're not going to do things the same old way. They did things the same old way, and Trump is too. So the party has to provide the leadership, and people need to join the African People's Socialist Party. If there are people who are not members of our party and need to join the Uhuru movement, if there are people who are not members of our movement, they need to join our work in Africa, join our work in the Caribbean, join our work throughout the United States, join our work in Minneapolis, Minnesota, join our work in St. Louis and the various other places we are located, join our work in England and in France and other places in Nigeria, et cetera, where we are working to build this revolutionary project, because the outcome has to be revolution. It has to be overturning this relationship that we have with white power and not just being taken off point, or not just being satisfied with a powerful demonstration in response to the system that allows the system to stand there unfazed as a consequence of what we've done. And sometimes it comes out stronger. So we have to do everything we can to bring it down and liberate our Africa, liberate our people and the oppressed peoples of the world, and especially all the working and toiling masses. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you so much for those closing statements, Chairman. And because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question was not answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman does see your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For revolutionary news and analysis, you can visit theburningspear.com. And for revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via our Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. If you united with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party, no matter where it is you're located in the world, visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Order your copy of Chairman Malia Shatella's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution. It was the piece that we were reading from on today, and you can order that at burningspearmarketplace.com. Coming up August 15th and 16th, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations is virtually hosting their annual conference themed Fight for Black Power, Free All Political Prisoners. The fight for Black Power requires the immediate release of all our political prisoners. You can register today at blackisbackcoalition.org. We are calling on people to follow the All African Peoples Development and Empowerment Project on Facebook or visit developmentforafrica.org for important information and helpful tips in regards to COVID-19. Uhuru Furniture Stores in Oakland and Philadelphia go live on Facebook every week to highlight beautiful new pieces and build the African economic self-determination. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, tune in every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time at facebook.com/Uhuru Furniture Philly. In Oakland, California, tune in every Wednesday and Saturday at 12 p.m. Pacific Time at facebook.com/Uhuru Furniture Oak. Lastly, to keep up with our movement events, visit theburningspear.com's events page and subscribe to our mailing list. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.